For as little as $1 per month, you can support independent journalism by supporting Mieum Media on Patreon. That's mere pocket change to support quality local content creation. To subscribe, visit patreon.com/MIEUM Media. Thank you to all paid subscribers for helping to grow Mieum Media and for supporting independent journalism. While marijuana has been a part of the United States cultural landscape for decades, only in recent years has recreational pot been legalized in a number of localities. Alaska, California, Colorado, the District of Columbia, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, Nevada, U.S. Overseas Territory, the Northern Mariana Islands, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington State have all legalized marijuana in some fashion in the past decade. This shouldn't be a surprise. For years, advocates argued that marijuana is not as detrimental as other illegal drugs, that regulation and taxation are a better approach, and that punishing people for the mere possession of marijuana was a simple waste of resources. In the past 50 years, support for marijuana legalization increased from 12% to 66%, and even conservative pollster Rasmussen found that only 9% of voters think that the so-called war on drugs is succeeding. Many people believe Connecticut will legalize marijuana in 2019, given newly inaugurated Governor Ned Lamont's support for the issue. But some activists say that Connecticut needs to right the wrongs of its past anti-drug policies, along with any legalization that occurs.
Just turned 16 and I got caught smoking off campus, and we were walking to school together with another friend of mine who was 16 and one who was 15, and somebody called the school to let them know what we were doing, and we got caught as soon as we walked on campus. I was charged with possession of marijuana and intent to sell to a minor because my friend was 15 and we had admitted that we had smoked together. I was suspended for 45 school days, and so that was from the beginning of November to the end of February. Every snow day made it longer. Every other school cancellation protracted my suspension.
This is Jason Ortiz, who is working with Connecticut United for Reform and Equity, or CURE. It's a group pushing for the legalization of marijuana, but that's not all.
When we figure out the details of legalization, for us, the big piece is releasing the prisoners and expunging the records. Connecticut has made that a little bit difficult with the way they have classified drug offenses in Connecticut, but we're going to work through that. The other piece of it is, when we discuss licenses and who's going to own this industry, social equity has to be a part of that conversation. That's the number one thing we think. If that is not part of the conversation, it's going to be a very long time before we can correct this problem. And then lastly, we do believe that we should create institutions that support community reinvestment. There's lots of ways we can do that, but we want to make sure we address the prisoner issue, we ensure that ownership is from those communities, and that those communities are getting the dollars that we're promising as we discuss legalization.
CURE is concerned that proposals in other localities have not gone far enough.
Just look at the data of how many people of color or minority-owned businesses are in the industry, and it's less than 1% in just about every state there is. And especially places like California, that makes no sense, right? There's plenty of very successful people of color in those states, but Massachusetts, a good friend of mine, Shalene Title, who I've known for a long time, recently was quoted saying out of 79 provisional licenses, 0 went to people of color, and she's the social justice chair of the Massachusetts Cannabis Commission. And so if the administrators that are creating the program are telling us that the number is 0, that's a serious problem.
Numbers from the Brookings Institution show, on average, that while white people do drugs more than black people, and both groups sell drugs at about the same rate, black people are far likelier to be incarcerated for drug-related crimes.
It's clear that over 70% of the arrests were young men of color. And that's been for many decades now. And so the data, the arrest data has been there. And so it's very clear, it has been young men predominantly, right? And so a lot of parents and breadwinners and folks that were funding their families were ripped from those families and put in prison. The damage done by the war on drugs and the public policy created by folks that don't look like me and are not from my community was way more damage to all communities than anyone that's currently in prison, right? We're talking about selling a plant, and that's basically what it comes down to. And so I think those folks should be offered an opportunity to do that in a way where they can pay taxes and contribute rather than costing us so much money putting, hardworking people behind bars.
I spoke with some voters off the record who supported marijuana legalization, but expressed some discomfort with the idea of letting offenders out of prison. They argued that the people in prison still broke the law, even if the law in question was unjust or ill-conceived.
It would be very hypocritical for us to allow these folks to continue to be in cages over something that somebody else is out here making a lot of money for. And so while I understand that they committed a crime when they did it, this law was ridiculous from day one. And it is something that was implemented purposefully to disrupt certain communities. And so I think that's an unjust law, and we should let those folks out. Not only let them out, but let them out and give them some opportunity to do what they wanted to do to provide for their families through the cannabis industry.
CURE's advocacy is based around what they call the 10 elements of equitable cannabis policy. These range from releasing people incarcerated for drug offenses and expunging their records, to environmental safety standards and other policy proposals. CURE also advocates encouraging local businesses in communities adversely affected by the war on drugs to get into the marijuana industry.
Starting out with making sure that those communities have a real job pipeline, similar to what we do for Electric Boat or other big institutions in places like Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport. We're simply replicating what is seen as best practices in other industries for cannabis. And I think the cannabis revenue that comes from it can fund that and have those programs be the beginning of the industry. So right off the bat, those are the folks that we're focusing on, and allow them to get 1 or 2 years of a head start as other folks come into the industry, and that way we'll be there in places like Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport can get that extra revenue that comes from being the first movers. I just think we need to make sure that in Connecticut, it's at the forefront of the discussion.
While marijuana law reform will likely be on the docket in Connecticut's 2019 legislative session, I wanted to find out how optimistic Jason was.
I am optimistic. I think, New York is going to move faster than we can. Massachusetts has already gotten there. Rhode Island is talking about it. So there's pressure literally from all around us. And I think the elected officials currently are pretty educated now at this point. We've had the discussion many times. We've talked about medical marijuana. And so it's not so much having to go over the basics with folks, but really what is Connecticut's legalization going to look like?